GitHub has a download button that allows us to download an entire repository. But what if we don't actually need everything in that repo? Maybe we're just looking to download a single file or folder, for example. Unfortunately, GitHub doesn't provide a straightforward way to accomplish this through the user interface, but there are a handful of solutions, many of which are probably easier than you might expect. In this tutorial, we're going to cover 6 different ways to accomplish this task. So let's go ahead and start with the easiest methods, and then we'll work our way through the list from there. The most obvious approach is to use any download buttons that might be available to us through GitHub's user interface. But there are really only 2 places that you'll find a button. One is on certain types of images, such as JPEG and PNG files. But even this download button is inconsistent. Sometimes the image will get downloaded directly, as we see here, and other times the image will just be opened in a new tab, after which we would need to right-click on the image to open the browser's context menu, select Save Image As, and then give it a name before clicking Save again to have it downloaded to our machine. The other download button can be found on the repo's homepage, but since this downloads the entire repository, we would then need to manually sort through the repo, drag out what we need, and delete everything else. And chances are that if you're watching this video, this is exactly what you're trying to avoid. After all, this can become a tedious process, especially if the repo is large and/or the content we need is deeply nested. Additionally, we might prefer a programmatic solution. With that said, we'll move on to using the browser's context menu. We just covered this a moment ago, but this time we're going to be using it with scripts. And chances are this is the answer that most viewers are looking for. So here we have a bash file located inside of a repo, hosted on github.com. Notice that there's a raw button here. We can right-click that, select Save Link As, click Save, and finally navigate to the browser's download location to get that file. Keep in mind that this was done with Google Chrome, but all major browsers have a similar user interface. We can go to the same file in Safari, for example. We'll right-click the raw button and select either Download Linked File or Download Linked File As. We'll save this one as Get Completion 2. And sure enough, we can see that the file was downloaded successfully. Now, in some cases, the browser might not recognize the file type, and the file will get saved with the wrong extension. If we try to download this SVG file, for example, it gets saved as a text file. And if we attempt to preview that file, all we see is text. To fix this, first make sure that the file isn't currently opened in any programs, like a text editor. That way we don't get any strange errors as we're making changes to the file. Of course, if we never open the file, then that step isn't necessary. From here, we'll just rename the file and give it the correct extension, changing txt to svg. Then we'll preview it again, and here we see the SVG as expected. Now, while this is one of the easiest ways to get a specific file from GitHub, there is the possibility that it will fail if you're trying to download an extremely large file. And since it only works for files, it's not an all-encompassing solution for those that need to download specific folders. The third option that can work for both files and folders is to use a third-party tool. And there are a variety of working tools out there that come in different forms, including browser extensions and web apps, for example. In our case, we'll take a look at downgit. Using this website, we'll go to the resource that we need from GitHub, copy the URL, paste that URL into the downgit input, click download, go to our browser's download location, unzip, and we have our file. We can repeat those same steps for a folder. So let's go back to downgit, remove the file from the path so that the link is leading to the parent directory, click download, and we get the entire folder with all of the contents included. Okay, so up to this point, all of the solutions we've explored have dealt with using a graphical user interface, where we click around and get results. But if you're still watching, you probably need something a bit more advanced. And for that, we'll jump into a terminal and use a command line interface. The first technique that we'll dive into here is using Subversion, which is a version control system much like Git. And using an alternative to Git in order to download content from a website named GitHub sounds a bit counterintuitive. But the problem is that Git Archive is a Git feature that GitHub doesn't support yet. And that happens to be the feature that would allow us to download individual folders and files from a repository. GitHub does, however, support many Subversion features, including SVN export, which is the solution we'll be using. Now, you will need Subversion installed, which is a separate topic you'll want to research, but there's a good chance that it's already on your machine. Here, we'll assume that it's installed properly. We'll go to a file on GitHub, and we're going to use the URL as a starting point, but we'll need to make some changes to it before using it on the command line. We need to keep the github.com portion. We also want to keep the name of the repo owner, which in this case is Babel, and we want to keep the name of the repo, Babel ESLint. After that, we only want the path to the file. So if we look down here at the breadcrumb navigation, we can see that from the root of the Babel ESLint repo, the file can be found in the lib directory with the name of parse.js. Looking back in the URL, we already have that path. But in between the two portions of the URL that we need, there's this blob master portion that we don't need. We don't want to just delete this portion completely though. Instead, we want to replace this with the word trunk. And after we've done that, we're now ready to copy this URL. Then we'll go back into the terminal. I'm going to change the working directory to my desktop so that the contents get downloaded there. We'll type in SVN export followed by the URL we just finished constructing, hit enter, and sure enough, we see that file downloaded to the desktop. We'll then do the same thing for our folder by using the exact same command, but before we hit enter, we'll remove the file name so that the path leads to the lib folder. And once again, we see that the target content appears on the desktop. Now, if we don't want to rely on a version control system, another option that we have here in the terminal is to make an HTTP GET request directly using a command line tool known as curl, which stands for Client URL. Curl is used for transferring data using a variety of protocols, one of which includes HTTP. Again, there's a good chance that this tool is already installed on your computer, but if not, you'll need to do that first. So with curl installed, we'll type in the command curl, followed by the O or output flag, the name that we want to save the file as, and finally the file's GitHub URL. So we'll go back to GitHub to get the URL. We're going to download a file from Microsoft's VS Code repo, but this time we don't want the repository link because that would just return the HTML of this page. Instead, we want to left-click on the raw button to navigate to the direct file link, after which we can copy the URL, paste it into the terminal, press enter, and again, we can see that we now have our target file. But what if we want to make GET requests for every file in a folder? Sure, we could do this manually for each one, but a better approach would be to do it programmatically, especially if there are hundreds of files. That brings us to the final, most dynamic solution, which is to use the GitHub API. And this is actually the method that the downgit website is using under the hood. So let's head over to the documentation for version 3 of GitHub's REST API. In the overview, we find that api.github.com is the base URL that we'll need to use. So we'll copy that, and we're interested in getting content from a file or folder in a repo, which is going to lead us to this next endpoint. So we'll paste in the base URL that we just copied. Then we'll grab this template and append it to the base URL. Now all we need to do is replace the placeholders. We'll need the owner, the repo name, and finally the nested path. And we're going to look up the same file that we just downloaded with curl. So the owner is Microsoft, the repo name is VS Code, and the path is source main.js. Once the URL is constructed, we'll hit enter here to view the results in the browser. And we see that we get a JSON object with all of the information needed for that file. We've got the file name, the type showing us that this is in fact a file as opposed to a folder, and the download URL. And notice that this download URL is the same URL that we used to download the file with curl. So let's go ahead and modify this endpoint and remove the file name so that we can see what the source folder data looks like. Again, we get JSON data, but this time it's an array of objects, with each object representing content that exists in that source folder. We see a lot of content with the file type, along with the respective download URLs. But if we scroll all the way to the bottom and look at the type, notice that there are a couple of objects that represent directories. These don't have a download URL, but they do have a URL property. And if we click on that URL, we get JSON data for all of the content that exists in that directory. So hopefully you can kind of see where this is going. Essentially, you can write a script that gets the JSON data for a specific folder, and then recursively goes through all nested content, creates folders, and downloads all of the files for each of those folders. We won't cover that code in this tutorial since that would be an entire video in itself, but you can probably get some inspiration by looking at DownGit's code, which is hosted on GitHub. And with that, we've covered 6 different ways to download specific files and folders from GitHub. Be sure to let us know in the comments which solutions worked best for you. And of course, if you have any additional tips, feel free to share those as well.